While units of the 1st Czechoslovak Brigade were fighting in the Podcharenja area on 1 and 2 February 1945, units of the 3rd Czechoslovak Brigade, operating on the northern flank of the corps, advanced westward in the course of hard fighting and captured the village of Zaya in the Semishyanka River Valley and the village of Viterna Poruba to the south. This village had been General Svoboda's main observation post during the 2-month fighting at Liptovsky Mikulas. After a short artillery preparation, the 3rd Brigade launched an attack on 2 February in the Shire area as part of the main corps forces offensive in the general direction of Jalowag. However, as soon as our soldiers reached the ridge stretching in front of this village, they were suddenly hit by a barrage of artillery and mortar fire and dense rifle and machine gun fire. Our infantry, having suffered sensitive losses, lay down. Soon the corps commander ordered it to withdraw to the original position. Despite the failure and losses, this attack nevertheless gave positive results. It allowed to reveal the enemy's forces, to determine his best defensive positions, helped the command to conclude that, without a deep study of the enemy's defence, it was impossible to attack further. The battles of 1 and 2 February helped to clarify the contours of the enemy's leading edge. It seemed that there were real chances for success. The corps commander decided to make a decisive blow with the main forces of the corps to bypass the enemy, cut off his retreat to Ruzomberok and destroy him. On February 3, at 12 o'clock, after a short but powerful artillery preparation, the main forces of the corps began an attack in the direction of Jalowag. But after a few hundred meters, the advancing infantry was stopped by heavy artillery and mortar fire. A second attack in the afternoon had the same result. 1 unit machine gunners were more successful. 1 unit liberated the Smesakanovi, and another unit liberated the village of Okolichne, the last village before Liptovsky Mikulas. However, it was not possible to break through the enemy defence. Our infantry, barely having risen to the attack from the initial position hidden from the enemy, suffered significant losses and had to lie down again. Given the failure of the offensive, the corps commander ordered to stop further attacks. Ahead of us awaited new heavy battles. The sad results of the previous battles forced us to significantly strengthen the corps units with Soviet artillery, especially mortars and katyushas. However, even after that, we did not achieve success. 2 days later, our infantry, after 30 minutes of artillery preparation, again rose to the attack, but, having overcome 800 meters, was stopped by the concentrated and well-controlled fire of the enemy's artillery and infantry means. Repeated attacks did not yield any results. The offensive actions of the corps were suspended from 6 to 11 February. The troops of the 1st Czechoslovak Corps were on the defensive on an 8-kilometer line of contact with the enemy, which stretched from the Liptovsky Mountains along the valley of the Semishyanka River in a southerly direction, and along the Var River 2 kilometers from Liptovsky Mikulas, where it bumped into the neighboring units of the 8th Infantry Division. Tired and exhausted fighters, of course, needed rest. The short respite we used intensively for reconnaissance. The battles again showed that the initial information about the enemy was incomplete, and this was the main reason for the failure of our attacks, undertaken with strong artillery support. In addition, the fight of our infantrymen was complicated by the insufficient training of artillery specialists, scouts, observers, gunners, gun and platoon commanders. Recruits called up from the reserve did not have the necessary qualifications, and the specialists trained in a very short period of time, as practice showed, often failed to cope with the requirements placed on them. There were cases when specialists of technical branches of the armed forces called up from the reserve were sent to infantry units. The negative consequences of such neglect of the needs of the artillery were fully realized during the January-February battles for Liptovsky Mikulas. The work of the artillery's reconnaissance organs was crucial to the effectiveness of fire and thus to the success of the battle. In addition to technical skills, certain personal qualities were required of them, which were not given immediately and not so easily. Checking the work of scouts at artillery stations, I now and then met with the so-called dead front. There was no enemy in front, as if he had disappeared somewhere, and it seemed that there was no way to identify him. In the observation logs, there were only occasionally specific entries about him. When I asked how many enemy targets had been set up on this or that NP since the morning, I was told that it was as if there were no Germans on the opposing heights. So, they said, they had not seen anyone and had not set up anything. Well, I usually said in such cases, if there is no enemy, then why are we sitting here? Let's go straight from this NP to the next height, on which, in your opinion, there are no Germans. but there, of course, passed the German line of defence. In battle, there is no more serious disadvantage than incomplete data about the enemy. The battles at Liptovsky Mikulas showed that the bitter lessons of Reconnaissance and Mikulas had already been forgotten. The newcomers had to pay with their own blood for the acquired experience, because they had not taken into account in time the old experience, which had already justified itself. I was very angry with those who ignored the lessons of the past. Life is life, I told them. It can neither be stifled nor hidden. In every defensive position on either side, life is bound to show itself sooner or later. If the weary observer slackens his attention for just a second, a sign of life on the enemy's side will escape him. And this single missed moment will have to be repaid later with blood. An interrupted observation of the enemy cannot be called an observation. At that time, at the beginning of the fighting for Mikulas, I had no idea how quickly these words of mine would be confirmed. At the post of the battery commander of the 3rd Artillery Regiment's 122mm howitzer battery, set up on a mountain ridge east of Gia, I again heard the familiar reply, "We have not found anything since morning." It was past 11 o'clock. I sat down at the telescope, determined not to move until I had tracked down the enemy. Metre by metre, I combed the front line, never taking my eyes off the snow-covered slopes west of Jard and Smechen. 3 hours had passed, and I was staring through the glass to no avail. My eyes, tired from prolonged scrutiny, were gradually becoming heavy, and that was the number one enemy of every scout. All to no avail. Finally, on the 4th hour of observation, I suddenly detected signs of the enemy's existence. I could not believe my eyes. On the snowy open ground, 3 Germans, clumsily one after another, came out of some shelter. The battery commander opened fire with 1 gun on the identified target, and about the 8th shell achieved a direct hit. A black column of smoke rose from the ground, and when it dispersed, 2 more Germans crawled out of hiding. There was no doubt that we had discovered and destroyed an enemy machine gun emplacement, one of those that had probably claimed many of our infantrymen's lives. On 12 February, after a brief 5-day respite, the Corps units prepared for the offensive. In the early frosty morning, they reached the initial line of attack and waited for the end of the artillery preparation, conducted on the scale of the army. Since morning snow was falling, strong wind was blowing. Visibility dropped to 100-200 meters. In these conditions, after 15 minutes, the army commander suddenly stopped firing and postponed the time of the offensive to another day. The infantry gradually withdrew from the original line to their former positions. I remember those events well. Then, for several days, I felt discussing. I was tormented by a cough, high fever, wheezing in the chest. My legs became heavy. Day by day, I was getting worse, and I could hardly climb up to the NP of the corps. It all looked like pneumonia. The artillery was ready to fire, just give the command. Could I be sick here? In the fever, I had a thought. Why should we always conduct our artillery fire according to a single pattern established in the army? After all, to support the infantry can be different ways. What if we started the infantry attack without the obligatory artillery preparation? The disgusting weather created absolutely ideal conditions for a stealthy and silent attack without artillery fire. The infantry, thanks to surprise, would seize the first line of trenches, and then we would open fire on more distant targets. I had already painted in my mind a picture of the great success of the infantry if we planned our fire in this way. That day, 12 February, I gazed impatiently into the snowy distance. The very next day, 13 February, the battalions moved to their original positions at 3 o'clock in the morning. The mood was depressed. They marched in total darkness, in deep snow. About 9 o'clock in the morning, after a powerful artillery preparation, the Czechoslovak and Soviet units again went on the attack. And this time, as soon as the infantry rose from the ground and went forward, the enemy opened on it a massive fire from artillery and mortars, accompanied by the fire of infantry weapons. Particularly devastating was the flank fire of Nazi heavy machine guns and a large number of snipers located on the dominant southern slopes of the Liptovsky mountains. There were also located the enemy's favorable positions with a long-range view of the entire battlefield in the Vega Valley. Not surprisingly, the infantrymen could not advance further than 600 meters from the initial line. During the attack in the afternoon, the infantry again failed to take advantage of the strong artillery support. The battalions were almost stuck in place. They lay down on a bare plain where there was no shelter and the frozen ground did not allow them to entrench. Enemy artillery relentlessly hit the helpless infantrymen. In some places, panic-stricken people tried to flee. Neither the brigade commander's orders nor the corps commander's liaison officers sent forward were able to move the infantry. Fierce enemy fire and a sense of fear chained the infantrymen to the ground. The Soviet 17th Guards Corps, operating on the southern flank of the front, also failed to succeed. We had 600 killed and wounded in that battle. Having assessed the situation, General Svoboda ordered to withdraw the infantry back to the original position. We had a suspicion that an enemy observer was sitting on the tower of the church in the village of Bobrovets, and when our infantry started to move to the attack line, gave a signal to the Germans. As soon as the infantry cautiously climbed behind the hill that hid it from the enemy, it was immediately subjected to concentrated crossfire from the front and flank. From where could an observer view the dead space in which the initial position of our units was located? Only the tip of the Bobrovets tower was visible behind the ridge. Profile construction showed that from there the infantry's initial position could be seen. I ordered the commander of the 5th Heavy Artillery Regiment to disarm the observer. It is difficult for the uninitiated to imagine how hard it is to hit a small turret top from a howitzer from 7 kilometers away. Since the morning, the dedicated gun had been firing at the turret, and its top, despite the fire, continued to stare defiantly down at our infantry. The enemy observer apparently sneered at our firing. Annoyed at the failure, I jokingly promised a special prize of a keg of wine to be drunk at my expense by the victorious battery. This condition was greeted with enthusiasm by the artillerymen. From each battery was allocated one gun. The contest began. More than once the tension reached the limit. More than once it seemed that a shell hit the turret. Finally, the turret caught fire and disappeared in smoke. I never learnt which of the batteries got the victorious prize. A man in battle, attempts to break through the enemy defences failed. The corps was still trampled on the place where it had stopped a fortnight ago. Casualties were mounting, heavy fighting, hardships, unsuccessful attempts to break through the defences threatened to break the morale of the fighters, especially inexperienced recruits, of whom there were up to 50% in the brigades. Some fighters' nerves failed, and they looked for deliverance in death. All this alarmed the command. The reasons for the failures were many. First of all, poor knowledge of the enemy, who had superbly chosen defensive lines built forcibly by the local population. On both flanks there were excellent observation posts where observers fanatically devoted to Hitler and fascism had settled. The enemy was well camouflaged, and movement in his camp was kept to a strict minimum. Our NPS did not allow good observation of the enemy. We had many other shortcomings. Attack from the start of such positions could not lead to success. Nothing gave nothing, and repeated attacks. If a good reconnaissance had been carried out, it would have shown that no time should have been spared for the comprehensive preparation of the offensive. In Smekany and Gyara, I had to observe recruits after an attack or mortar fire. They did not know how to shoot, to camouflage, to conduct close fire. They had an absent, frightened look in their eyes. They were unable to perceive what was happening around them. In their eyes I could see no calmness, no self-confidence, no trust. I will never forget their eyes. There was only extreme fatigue, coldness, and fear in them. These men were afraid of death and, above all, of their own fear. They were afraid they could not bear it all. And in vain they had been told that fear was half the misery. They didn't believe it. What frightens them the most, I thought, as I saw such people in such a pitiful state for the umpteenth time? What has made such an oppressive impression on them and is forever engraved in their memory? They wanted to live. To live. It's not easy to leave this world. Try to tell the young man that he must live like one who will be killed tomorrow or who is always waiting for death. Tell him that fighting is much easier than we imagine it to be, that everything in the world is easier if a man is absorbed in his work. You, a man of years, reconciled with himself and with people, explain all these things to the young. Do you think they'll believe and understand? The spirit of death hovered over the valley of Smereshyanka. 4 major offensives had brought much misery and suffering. The number of imaginary crosses was growing. An oppressive atmosphere of doom reigned over Zyar, over the Semestians, in the neighbourhood of Vitalisovs, and yet a ray of hope shone through it, calling for a courageous and selfless struggle of those who would replace the fallen. The Corps Command compensated for the loss of 3,200 soldiers killed in the Dukla operation by mobilizing 8,000 recruits. After a brief training, The recruits were integrated into the frontline units. The new recruits made up almost 50% of the infantry brigade's personnel. From 20 January to the beginning of April, a total of about 20,000 men, mostly of Slovak nationality, were mobilized. The combat qualities of this mass replenishment of the frontline corps units, due to the accelerated training of the recruits, proved to be insufficient, unsophisticated and poorly trained. The fighters, after the first unsuccessful attacks in the harsh battles, lost faith in their strength and hung their heads. February defense. After the unsuccessful fourth attempt to break through the Nazi defense, the 1st Czechoslovak Army Corps, by order of the 18th Army Command, temporarily went on the defensive in order to better prepare for future battles. New offensives did not begin until 3 March and lasted until 11 March. In front of us were the enemy's defensive positions, a narrow strip of native Czechoslovak land for which we had been fighting since 2 February. A strong, dry wind was blowing. The prickly, icy needles were hitting us in the face. The wind dispersed the clouds. The sky turned blue. The snow sparkled under the rays of the sun, and the snow-white steeps of the Liptov Mountains and the low Tatras were covered with a pink veil. Snow-covered villages stood at the foot of the mountains that rose threateningly on either side of the narrow Var Valley. As far as the eye could see, snow-covered fields stretched away. The snow was waist-high, and in some places even higher than a man's height. Silence and splendor reigned all around. Amidst this beauty, which could enchant any tourist and connoisseur of nature, we were to engage in a battle, which after Dukley was destined to become the biggest battle in the history of the Czechoslovak troops, but we didn't know it at the time. Both flanks of the enemy defense were firmly based on mountain ranges, densely forested, steep and difficult to pass through. It was impossible to encircle or bypass the enemy defense. Huge snowdrifts hindered the actions of reconnaissance groups. Our units were faced with the inevitable necessity to attack the enemy head-on. At the front, there was a sepulchral silence. Everything testified to the fact that the enemy did not intend to give up his positions cheaply. It was also enough to recall the fierce fighting near Liptovsky Gradok, near Pochin and elsewhere in the German defense supply line. This became especially clear after the breakthrough attempts made on 3, 5, 12 and 13 February, when decisive attacks were made not against weak enemy covering forces, but against a stubbornly defended area with a well-organized fire system. The 320th German Division was ready to fight. The transition of our troops to defense was to create real prerequisites for a breakthrough. At a meeting of the command staff held on 14 February by the commander of the 18th Army and his deputies, summed up the results of the last battles and set new tasks. The commander stressed the need to increase the morale of soldiers, good training, thorough study of enemy defences and, above all, enemy reconnaissance in front of the 1st Czechoslovak Corps. Reconnaissance was heard at every turn in our units. However, the enemy was on guard. It was impossible to take the tongue. And the ground was frozen, and every careless movement was heard far away. In such cases, the enemy immediately illuminated the front line and opened fire on our scouts. Information about the enemy was still scarce. However, this was characteristic of the whole period of fighting from Dukley to Mikulas. On the 15th of February, General Svoboda and I stood on the roof of a barn at Wityrna Poruba and surveyed the white space in enemy territory. The general was studying the terrain where the offensive was planned. After a meeting held the day before, he had decided to overturn the German defense in the Liptovsky Mikulas area by means of an encompassing maneuver by the forces of the right flank, in order to strike at the foothills of the Liptovsky Mountains to cut the enemy's only road of retreat to Ruzomberok. There was silence all around. Everything froze. Suddenly the corps commander asked me a tricky question. How to provide more effective artillery support for the offensive in the future? I expected such a question, and therefore answered without hesitating. We should attack without artillery preparation. The general pondered, silently looking at me with a probing look. The next day I, together with the chief of staff of the corps and the head of the operational department, went to inspect the enemy positions. From Wityrna Poruba, we went straight through the snow to the heights near Smakani. Halfway there, we were overtaken by a blizzard. A strong snowstorm was blinding our eyes, making it difficult to move. We decided to go down to Smirikani and take shelter from the weather there. For a long time, we wandered somewhere in the snow, having no idea where the hell we were going. This began to worry us. The chief of staff did not hide his anxiety. He decided to wait in place until the storm subsided. We sat down on some kind of hill. The snow was falling in thick flakes from the west side and literally covered everything around us. Soon a snowdrift formed where we were sitting, from which only our eyes and shapeless, snow-covered hats could be seen. We were completely lost in the white shroud. When I looked at my companions, I could not help smiling, though I was not laughing. We decided to wait out the storm in this position, and it turned out to be our good fortune. The storm ended as suddenly as it had begun. The horizon cleared of clouds, the air became clear. And then, my God! We opened our eyes wide in amazement and pulled our heads in horror. In front of us rose the key height of Nikovo. That is, we were in the zone of direct fire of the enemy's infantry weapons, at a distance of only 700 meters from the nodes of his defense. Around us stretched only a snow-covered field. At such a distance you can see a partridge. If the enemy detected us, there would be no escape. We glanced round anxiously, wondering who might move and shake off the saving snow cloak. Lomsky winked his eye. He understood everything. Dochkal was rather indifferent to everything. So we sat on the snow like those French soldiers who, under a hail of shells, sat in the trenches at Verdun until they were covered with earth up to their waists. If they knew what carp were in their nets, who sat under their very noses with documents and maps in their bags, sitting in a motionless posture and waiting for darkness turned out to be an endless torment. Gradually a doubt crept into my soul. Are not the Germans playing cat and mouse with us? Aren't they stalling for time to swat us later? The nerves of every one of us were frayed to the limit by the proximity of the enemy, to whom a blind chance had given us away. There was no possibility of doing anything. Only when dusk had fallen and the peak of Nikovo disappeared in the darkness, we, as if stung by a tarantula, hurried to Veterna Poruba, where a snow-covered car was waiting for us. Who could have been luckier than us? New hopes, new disappointments. March was approaching. Our commanders and personnel of the units were intensively preparing for a new offensive. In the evening of March 1, the commander of the 1st Czechoslovak Army Corps gave the order to break through the enemy defense on March 3. The main blow was planned to be struck in the center of the Corps' location in the direction of Smerikany, Bobrovitz. In accordance with the Corps commander's order, both infantry brigades without one battalion and the main forces of the Soviet 24th Infantry Division were concentrated north of the Var River. Here, on a 5-kilometer stretch of the front, there was a clear superiority of our troops. The breakthrough was planned to be carried out by a combined attack from the front on Liptovsky Mikulas, which was to be occupied by the Soviet troops, and a deep covering maneuver from the north by the forces of both our brigades. The night of 3 March passed rather restlessly, and this is understandable. After all, on the results of the offensive depended whether the enemy's defence, which he held for a month, would be broken through, and whether the period of pursuit and victorious offensive up to Prague would be. Early in the morning, while it was still dark, our units took up their initial positions. The commanders and personnel of the troops cherished the hope that this time the enemy defence could be broken through. I looked intently into the darkness in the direction of the enemy. There was dead silence all around. Thick snow was falling from the overhanging clouds. The snowflakes picked up by the wind were hitting my face. Everything was blurred before my eyes. The general stood next to me. He silently looked in the direction of the invisible enemy. It seemed inappropriate to speak in these minuses, so I stood silent too. The general looked more tired today than usual. He was certainly conscious of his personal responsibility. At last he spoke. There was anxiety in his voice. "Shall we get through today?" he asked, and the words reflected the whole range of his feelings: anxiety, hope. "Of course we'll make it," I said without hesitation. "Are you just saying that, or are you convinced?" he asked in his unique, soft voice, with pauses between each word. I looked the general straight in the eye and said that I believed in success. He shook his head calmly. It seemed to me as if my answer made him feel better. He asked me nothing more. At that moment I felt a burning gratitude and sympathy for this man. I believed in the upcoming success, although I was concerned about the surprise factor. Unfortunately, my idea to launch an attack without artillery preparation was not taken into account, and it was hard to think of more favourable weather for this. Snowfall muffled the sounds and would allow soldiers to crawl to the enemy positions at throwing distance. The interaction of infantry with artillerymen and sappers had been discussed and worked out in detail, so such an attack could succeed. It was the 7th hour of the morning. In half an hour the infantrymen, positioned in groups in the snow, will prepare for the attack, and the snowstorm did not subside. The outlines of our barn on the hill near Veterna Poruba were barely visible, and then behind the Kosovo-Slovak positions there was the rumble of many guns firing. The usual artillery preparation had begun. 20 minutes to go, I said quickly, without concealing my excitement, and held out my hand with the luminous face of the clock to the general's face. He perked up and concentrated on waiting for the moment of attack. When it was reported that after the end of the artillery, preparation infantry broke into the enemy trenches and developed success in depth, the general visibly cheered up. However, the progress of the offensive was not everywhere satisfactory from the very beginning. Units of the 1st Brigade, acting in the direction of the main blow, in the morning advanced up to 3 kilometers and penetrated into the village of Bobrovets, but there met stubborn enemy resistance. The advance of the 3rd Brigade units in the direction of Zia, the village of Yalovets, ended in failure. Their further advance was stopped by the enemy's artillery and small arms fire. However, at first the units managed to break into the trenches of the main defensive strip, but in the afternoon they had to retreat. The greatest success that day was achieved by units of the 24th Rifle Division under the command of General Prokhorov, which after a fierce battle took Liptovsky Mikulas. The respite was short-lived. The critical moment of the battle came. The enemy moved to decisive counterattacks, the strength of which gradually increased during the day. We lost key positions in the neighbourhood of Bobrovets and Trestin and some dominant heights. After 3 days of hard fighting, the Czechoslovak and Soviet units withdrew to their original positions. Only the 24th Division held Liptovsky Mikulas, but even it was threatened with encirclement. By its bloodshed and tension, these heavy battles surpassed the February battles. Both Czechoslovak brigades lost a total of more than 800 men, and the 24th Soviet Division lost almost 500 men. Hopes for success vanished. We did not take the enemy by surprise. Our soldiers could not withstand the continuous frenzied onslaught of the Nazis. It was painful to look the general in the eye. He did not hide his disappointment and suffered heavy losses in men. On the road from Veterna Poruba, General Svoboda did not utter a single word. Heroes and mere mortals. The offensive of 3 March marked the beginning of 9 days of fighting, the heaviest of all the battles fought in the area. Successful and less successful attacks were carried out day, and hot battles were fought for heights, settlements, woods and farms, which after capture were immediately lost. The situation was constantly changing from day to day and day to day. But in this long, merciless contest, one thing remained unchanged. Despite the temporary fluctuations, the enemy defence held firm. Some heights and villages were counterattacked by the enemy, for many days up to 6 times a day. In total, for 9 days, from 3 to 11 March, the fascists carried out 64 counterattacks on different parts of the front. In the course of the March battles, the command's choice of the direction of the main blow was decisive for their success. The creation of complete superiority of the advancing side in forces and means made it possible to break through the enemy defence and develop success in depth. An important issue was the necessary moral and combat training of soldiers and officers for heavy fighting. After all, the soldiers of the new replenishment joined the active battalions and immediately went into battle after several weeks or days of combat training. Fighting in the cemetery. On 3 March, units of the 3rd Czechoslovak Brigade engaged in intense fighting to gain control of an important vast ridge to the west of Jard. On that day, the enemy launched 5 attacks in order to regain their positions, where our units had wedged themselves in. More and more black craters from mine and shell bursts appeared on the snow. We sat together with Captain Zhuravlev of the Soviet Army in a shelter near Zia and watched the battlefield. The captain commanded a battery of Guards mortars and had come to us to support the 3rd Brigade's advance on Jalovets. Above the village, on the enemy side, was the snow-covered local cemetery. Bare tree crowns stood out in relief against the white background. In the morning our infantry approached the crest of the ridge and lay down there. For some time there was silence. Then there was a rumble of guns. There were flashes of bursts. The first shells howled and rained down on the infantrymen. When the fire was shifted further, dark figures of Germans appeared on the horizon. Shooting on the move, the Nazis rushed down the slope, but it did not come to a hand-to-hand fight. Our tired and battle-weary soldiers were panic-stricken, and they rushed away in the direction of the starting line. They were pursued by Hitlerites. Most of the fleeing did not even stop at the cemetery, although its strong fence allowed to organize a defense. The case could have taken a completely different turn if we had turned the cemetery into a strong stronghold. However, only a small group of our soldiers, realizing this, hid in the cemetery and opened heavy fire on the enemy. The cemetery above Gyard became the only area where our soldiers took their last stand. Having met an unexpected repulse, more and more Hitlerites were pulling to the area of the cemetery. I became anxious for the fate of the defenders. I painfully wanted to do something to help them. It was necessary to give a volley. Worriedly, I addressed to Zhuravlev, but the captain hesitated as he knew peculiarities of striking action of his firearms. The dispersion was quite significant, so that the brave defenders of the cemetery could suffer. The rockets are flying thick as rain, 32 bursts at once. Who would be left alive after such a volley? After all, these shells explode just above the surface of the ground, scattering a huge amount of shrapnel. There was still time to withdraw, as the defenders were not yet surrounded. I was so engrossed in observation that I did not notice how a group of Hitlerites crawled up to the cemetery from the rear. I shouted with all my might, trying to warn my soldiers, but how could I hear at such a distance? Then the ring closed. The Nazis infiltrated the cemetery, and a fierce fight broke out between the graves. The Czechoslovak soldiers had two choices: surrender or die. There was no other way. They chose to die in a fair fight. I was ready to give everything at that time, if only some guardian angel would appear and help them to save themselves. With what hatred I looked at the figures of the Hitlerites running over. A handful of our fighters, hiding behind graves and monuments, continued to wage an unequal battle with the Nazis. However, the resistance of the defenders was weakening. I realized that the end was approaching. The defenders of the cemetery remained less and less. It was the 12th hour. And then I saw a picture that made my heart freeze. The last of the Czechoslovak soldiers stood up with a machine gun in his hands among the graves and opened fire. He seemed to me like a giant and has remained in my memory to this day. He was a truly great man. The next moment I lost sight of him. He was killed. This hero was driven by love for his country and hatred of the enemy. That was his undefeatable strength. The death of the brave by the enormous power of example affects those who witnessed it. The atmosphere of everything experienced then left an indelible trace in my memory. Altitude 768, a flat hill northwest of Samarkand, which seems endless when you climb to its top. That is what height 768 is. Some maps list it as height 764. 15 minutes of quiet walking from the church and you're at the top. In the summer there are lush spreads swaying in the wind and excellent potatoes growing there. On the soil watered with blood, good harvests succeed. But in winter there are deserted snowfields. A cold wind blows along the Vega Valley. This is how we saw the height in the winter of 1945. The long unnamed hills stretching from Smysakyny along Semishyanka Valley forms a whole with height 768. The battles for this height were of tactical importance. Nevertheless, long, unprecedentedly stubborn battles were fought here. During the February battles, 4 attempts of the 1st Czechoslovak Corps to break through the fascist defence in this area ended in failure. On 3 March, the 1st and 3rd Battalions advanced up to 3 kilometres on this hill as a result of a morning attack, but were then forced to retreat to their original lines. On 4 March, units of the 320th German Division launched a night attack in an attempt to capture Bezimiany Hill and Smechety. At first we lost it, but after the morning counterattack of our infantry captured it again. In the afternoon, the enemy attacked the height 768 4 times, but was repulsed. The attacks on both heights on 5 March were unsuccessful. True, the enemy captured Bezimiany Height, but he failed to surround and destroy the 2nd Battalion. This battalion took the height 4 times and lost it as many times. By the end of the day, the enemy captured the height for the 5th time. On 6 March, the enemy made 6 attacks to regain the height of 768 and Bezimiany, which he again lost. Stubborn battles were also fought during the night. Enemy attacks to capture these tactically important heights continued until 11 March. This is a brief history of height 768. On 6 March, a new attack was being prepared at height 768. Being at the observation point, I literally felt this ringing, terrifying silence before the battle. On the height, right at its crest, our infantrymen were huddled on the ground. No movement was visible, as if everything there had died out. If our soldiers lying on the eastern slope of the ridge could crawl forward or jump up, they would see that on the other side of the ridge lay Hitlerites. also huddled on the ground with fear. Looking from the NP at all these soldiers on both sides of the peak, I involuntarily thought how many more of them would die here on this small piece of Slovak land. Of course, everyone was now in fear of the moment when they would get up from the ground and face the enemy. Suddenly I saw a big German man rise to his full height and start aiming his rifle in the direction where our infantrymen were lying down. Then, apparently after firing a shot, he quickly lowered his rifle and disappeared. In a couple of seconds, however, the German rose again, chose another victim and fired. The infantrymen continued to lie there without moving. The sniper walked a little to the side, carefully took aim and killed another of our soldiers. Every shot was a direct hit in the head. Helmets were no longer worn at that time. I had run out of patience. I called the battalion commander's artilleryman on the line and asked, "Isn't anyone going to finish this murderer?" It was impossible to fire from the cannon, because our positions were very close to the German positions, and with their fire could hit their own infantry. "Attack or move back," I shouted into the phone. From my observation point, I saw the whole sad picture. Suddenly one of our soldiers came up. He stood for a minute, as if thinking, and then stepped with a rifle in his hand towards the enemy, aiming at the German sniper, but suddenly collapsed to the ground like a cripple. Everything froze, and soldiers on both sides of the crest of the height continued to wait for the attack. The basis of true heroism in battle is always courage. On 5 March, during the period of heavy fighting of our brigade units near Liptovsky Mikulas, the 7th Battalion of the newly created 4th Czechoslovak Infantry Brigade went to the front. On 1.1 March, it was followed by the 8th Battalion. Until 14 March, all infantry units of this brigade, 3 infantry, and 1 battalion of machine gunners were already on the front line in the battles for the city and south of the Var River. On 18 March, 2 artillery regiments of the brigade arrived at They received their first material around 20 February. Thus, from 18 February, the entire 4th Infantry Brigade, numbering approximately 4,700 men, went into combat. Most of its personnel had received short-term training. The brigade consisted mainly of Slovak soldiers and officers, so Slovak became the official language, despite its little experience. The 4th Brigade quickly caught up with the other brigades in terms of tactical maturity and troop effectiveness during the fierce fighting near Liptovsky Mikulas and in the mountains of Mala and Bolna Fatra, Mark 748 AIA. On the northern side of Liptovsky Mikulas, the massive Gaj mountain overhangs it. Its slopes descend directly into the town, and this made it possible to keep any of its neighborhoods under fire. The height rises 190 meters above the town, and from it you can get an excellent view of the near and far surroundings. From the very beginning of the battles at Liptovsky Mikulas, this mark and the neighbouring height, 729, Nikiwo, formed the basis of the German defence north of the Wag River. This was the reason for the unprecedented persistence of the battles on this section of the front. On the snow-covered plains, hot battles were fought with varying success. Tired and frozen soldiers fell off their feet from fatigue. Many did not eat for 2 days. Difficult conditions and terrible losses affected the morale of the units. From 3 to 13 February 1945, Czechoslovak and Soviet units made a total of 4 attempts to break through the Nazi defences on the heights north of Liptovsky Mikulas. As a result of heavy fighting on 3 March, the 24th Soviet Rifle Division managed to seize the heights of Gay and Nikovu and liberate the town of Liptovsky Mikulas. But in the afternoon of 4 March, the enemy threw all forces to regain the lost heights. After a fierce battle, the enemy recaptured the Nikovu height, but the Soviet units kept the dominating height of Gaj in their hands. The enemy was aware of the key importance of both heights for his defence and therefore sought to hold these important positions at all costs. On 5 March, starting at 3 o'clock at night, the enemy launched 6 powerful attacks on Mark 748A and retook it. In view of the difficult situation in which the 24th Soviet Division found itself after the loss of the heights of Gay and Nikovo, General Svoboda decided to attack these heights on the night of 6 March with the forces of the 1st Brigade and part of the forces of the 24th Division. However, due to dense, well-organized enemy fire, our infantry could not even get close to the attack line and had to withdraw. During the rest of the night and the whole day of 6 March, the enemy was conducting active offensive actions. the battle for the heights flared up with renewed vigor. The enemy understood well that by holding the heights dominating over the city, he would be able to surround and destroy the 24th Soviet Division and then capture Liptovsky Mikulas. That is why he tried by all means to build on the success he had achieved. On the morning of 7 March, Czechoslovak and Soviet units again attacked the heights of Gaj and Nikovo. They were supported by the fire of one division of anti-aircraft 37M guns, which were operated by our girls. However, even this time, the attack was not successful. During the night and day of 8 March, the enemy attacked the positions of the Czechoslovak units 3 times. In the afternoon of 9 March, 3 battalions of the 1st Czechoslovak Brigade attacked Gaya and Nikovo. The Germans put up stubborn resistance and opened fire with all kinds of weapons. Our infantrymen lay down right in front of the German positions. Soon the commander of the 18th Army ordered to stop offensive actions and temporarily switch to defense. At this time, units of the 1st Czechoslovak Brigade replaced the 24th Soviet Division. On 5 March, Lieutenant General Hastilovich, commander of the army, arrived unexpectedly at the Corps observation post. He addressed me directly. I remember his stony, alienated, almost angry face when he spoke reproachfully about the fact that things on the damned heights were going badly, that the concentration of fire was weak, that it was necessary to immediately study the possibilities for strengthening the effectiveness of strike and to revise the planned tables of fire. I replied that we were scattering our forces in a sea of space, deaf and heavily rugged, that we could not give a more effective fire, as we did not have sufficient ammunition for it, and, above all, that we had no aerial artillery observer to correct our firing. Having spoken the bitter truth, I wiped my sweating face, and thought to myself that in the vast space behind the heights of Gay and Dikovo, the entire 320th German Division would be well concealed. To my surprise, the general did not contradict me. On height 748 Gay, there is a monument and graves of those who died here during the Second World War. At the entrance to the cemetery are 2 impressive sculptural groups. On the pedestal is the text in Slovak and Russian. You, dear ones, return our motherland to us. Bowing over your graves, we whisper, eternal memory to the defenders of our native land. For eternal memory to heroes who fell for the nation in the hard battle against fascism. For High from 16.3 to 4.4 1945 in the revolution of Liptovsky Mikulas. The last of the Czechoslovak soldiers buried in the military cemetery of Hajj was Major Engel, commander of the 3rd Battalion, who was transported there after exhumation in Vazek. He was killed on 29 January 1945 in the Battle of Sturba. The dates given in the text of the battle for the height of Gay are inaccurate, as the main battles for it had already started on 3 March 1945. Spacek and I. No, it will not go on like this. More than once I thought to myself about Spacek. We will have to send him to the penalty company. However, when it was necessary to enforce this decision, I did not have the heart to do so. If I think about it, I myself felt guilty before Spacek. I loved him. I did not like the cunning in his character. Long and carefully I observed his behavior, and finally came to the conclusion that what irritated me most of all was his confusion near the front line. Spacek was obviously a coward, and who needs a cowardly driver who cannot be relied upon in a critical moment? After all, there were cases when a car with officers unexpectedly bumped into the enemy, and then only the driver's self-control and skillful hands could save the day. I knew from experience that Spacek tried to stop the car far from the front line. I, on the other hand, in order to save time and effort, preferred to drive the car an extra kilometre of the way. I remembered how indecisive Spacek had behaved at Pocherin. I had to get out of the car earlier and make my way to Pocherini on foot alone, so as not to see his cowardice. Later I warned him that if he did not change his behaviour, I would send him back to his unit. With this condition he stayed with me. Soon after that we went to the village of Konska, near the Liptovsky mountains. From there we walked to the front line. We usually got out of the car before the last hill, which covered the road from the enemy's observation. As soon as someone appeared in his field of vision, he became a target of accurate mortar fire, the most murderous weapon at that time against living unprotected targets. On a bumpy, snow-soaked country road, we passed Konska and climbed at high speed to the crest of height 906. From there, after a few minutes' walk, a panorama of the enemy's defensive positions behind the Smachianka River was to open up before our eyes. no one had ever travelled here by car. Space got worried, started to twist on the seat and look in my direction, trying to guess whether I was serious about it. I was getting angrier and angrier at the sight of the frightened driver. Finally, I made a decision. Spaceake had no idea of the danger that lurked in the dead silence. I silently gestured with a single gesture for him to drive on. He only squinted at me. We stopped at the very top. We could see the car from here. "Wait here," I said in a tone that did not tolerate objections. "Here?" shrieked the astonished Spaceake. "Yes, here." I confirmed and pointed my finger at the place where we had stopped. Without a glance at Spaceake, I started down from the heights towards Yard. I was prepared to bet my head that Spaceake would run after me and ask me to send him and his car away from this place. But Spaceake only shook his head sorrowfully. I did not think he would pull himself together. I decided to myself that now was the right moment to wean him from his fear. But at the same time, and then it rumbled. I quickly looked back at the summit, from where burst after burst was heard. Spaceake. Now I was ready to give everything in the world for him to remain unharmed. I cursed myself why I hadn't sent the car somewhere far away. The enemy's batteries were still working, for the Willys standing on a bare peak was a suitable target for the enemy, and it was worth expending a lot of ammunition to destroy it. To distract myself a little, I began to remember the weaknesses in Spaceake's character. There was a lot of work to be done in Jard, and I kept wondering about Spaceake's fate. Concentrated fire on a single target portended the worst. He won't stand for that, I thought. And why not? Another voice in me objected. Everything can't be destroyed, after all. It was my only hope, weak and fragile, but I clung to it like a drowning man to a straw. My mind was working feverishly. How can I make things right? When the sun loomed over the horizon and the snow-covered fields were covered with long, dark shadows of bare trees and wooden buildings, I headed down the ravine towards Konskaya with gloomy forebodings. As I neared the summit, I slowed my steps. The car stood in the same place, though it looked strange. I shouted, feeling the excitement catching in my throat. After a while he came out of somewhere, straightened up, stomped on the spot, and silently stretched out his hands, palms up, as if carrying water in them. "It was in the car," he said. There were many heavy, sharp splinters on his palms. "They were lodged in the cabin." "Where were you?" He pointed to a small hole not far from the car. There was a note of pride in his voice as he told me how, in the midst of this hell, the ground began to fall away from under his feet. I understood his state of mind. Spaceake did not know that mentally I was hugging him. There was no trace of excitement or fear on the driver's face. He had to go through all this since I had decided to help him. True, the measure is a steep one, but I still felt distrustful of Spaceake on 2 occasions so far. Now my doubts were dispelled. Time showed that Spaceake had changed. The bravery shown by the driver, altitude 906, was the medicine he needed. I still can't understand how he withstood such shelling and didn't run away in fear. In short, he surprised me then. The fall of Liptovsky Mikulas. Having replaced the Soviet troops in Liptovsky Mikulas, our units found themselves in a difficult position. It was impossible to hold Liptovsky Mikulas for a long time without gaining the heights 748 and 729, which cut westwards into the enemy defence. Without capturing structures, these heights it was impossible to succeed in the area of Jalowik, Bobrowiec, on which depended the expansion of the breakthrough front and the destruction of the entire German defence. The Corps commander assigned the 1st Czechoslovak Brigade to defend the town. Because of the snowstorm, the change of the 24th Soviet Division was untimely and disorganized. Some units left their positions before the arrival of our units, and Lieutenant Colonel Broz, on the contrary, signed the protocol of surrender and acceptance of the front before the due date. By a strange coincidence, at the critical moment of the change of units, the Germans launched strong night attacks with artillery fire on a number of sections of the front at once. There was a suspicion that the Germans became aware of the changeover and decided to take advantage of it to capture the city. Indeed, on 10 March after midnight, a battalion of Hitler Youth fanatics crossed the Var unnoticed and, as a result of the attack, seized the suburb of Wierbika and advanced to Okoliczna. At the same time, the enemy attacked the railway station and barracks in the town. On the 9th of March, returning from the observation post in the village of St. Peter, I suddenly received the task of going immediately to Liptovsky Mikulas to the chief of the garrison. to Mikulas, but he is practically surrounded. Then, I thought, the pincers with which the enemy had enveloped this town could close at any moment. From Okoliczny there was no way to get through by road. There was only an 800-meter corridor between the cemetery in Okoliczny and the infamous Gajie Hill, but it was shot through with enemy machine-gun fire. Freezing and hungry, I drove out to Okoliczny. Of course I was interested in going there, but such an adventure was connected with exceptional risk. Yesterday's storm had swept up large drifts of snow. The village was completely snowed in, as if the bad weather of the past days had just fallen on it. The night of the 1st of March was suspiciously quiet. At that moment I did not know that in the grey gloom not far from us, the dark shadows of the enemy were creeping quietly like ghosts, aiming at the outskirts of the city. Good people found me a horse and sledge in Okoliczny. The rider tied rags around the horse's hooves and checked the quietness of the harness. It was impossible to do without a sleigh. The driver restrained my impatience, advising me to wait until the fog settled, and he was right. At about 4 o'clock in the morning we slowly drove out, and at once it was as if we plunged into milk. The horse trotted along the lush white carpet, but not even the creak of the skids could be heard. I stared into the darkness, waiting every minute for a shot or an enemy sentry. At last, through the fog, I could see a vague outline of buildings. It was Liptovsky Mikulas. We're through. The situation in the town was grave, and Broz didn't try to hide the hopelessness of the situation. The low combat effectiveness of the units did not give, according to him, no real hope of strengthening the defence. There were no officers in the battalions, not enough company and platoon commanders. Most of the personnel of the units were new recruits who had arrived at the front only on 6 March. They did not yet know how to handle weapons properly and had not been exposed to fire in battles. There was a shortage of machine gunners. Exhausted people fell asleep on the move. Experienced fighters remained a small group, but they fought with unparalleled courage against the superior forces of the Nazis. The city will not be held, Lieutenant Colonel Brush frankly told me. The surrender of the city could happen at any moment. In the brigade headquarters there was a nervous atmosphere. Broz looked pale and exhausted. No matter what he did, he was not the master of the situation. In an atmosphere of anxiety and confusion, soldiers, officers, messengers, liaison officers, ours and the Soviets, swarmed around him. In extreme strain, he was trying to simultaneously manage the battle, make decisions, assess information, solve material and personnel issues, and liaise with the corps. It was too much for one man. Amidst the noise and hum, his strong voice stood out sharply, then again muffled. How long will all this last? Ran through my mind at the sight of this picture. Things were coming to a swift end. The spectre of encirclement hovered over the city, creeping into the midst of soldiers in fighting positions, creeping into the minds of commanders and staff workers, paralyzing their wills with fears of their fate if they were captured by Nazi thugs. No one said the word encirclement out loud, but everyone realized it as a possible reality. The realization of this deprived even those who still hoped to defend the city of confidence. This was the situation in which the captured Hitlerite was brought in. He haughtily and loudly demonstrated the fascist greeting to the head of the garrison, and the interrogation did not come. Pictures of the unfolding battle for the city, one after another, crashed into my consciousness. During the day, the battles for the barracks, the railway station, and the suburb of Palutska were fought with varying success. After fierce attacks from different directions, Hitlerites gradually penetrated into the city. Our 76 mm anti-tank guns became the mainstay of the defence. Installed between barracks, they destroyed targets with amazing accuracy and terrified the enemy. The gun crews behaved bravely. Later, in the last battles for the city, they had the honourable mission of covering the retreat of the infantrymen with their fire. They did this by acting as a rearguard. I had to get back. It was getting dark. After the recent snowstorm and morning fog, the air was clear, frosty. Illuminated by the sunset, the surrounding nature seemed accentuated white and sparkled with purity. The weather was marvellous and peaceful, and people had to fight for their own lives. It was impossible to return in the daytime except to crawl along the ditch along the road to Okoliczny, 2 kilometres along the bottom of the ditch. When I was looking at my way back from the outermost townhouse, the battle was going on for the railway box located not far away. It was a long crawl. Halfway down I was already wet with sweat. Tried to do a marathon crawling, and even in a heavy coat, The day was slowly coming to an end. At last I reached the saving village and saw Space with his car. Space looked at me with surprise. We drove home on a starry night without saying a word. The night before, I had to experience the travails of walking again on the way to Liptovsky Mikulas. We were on the road from Stepies. In front of Okolichny, grey silhouettes of houses stood out against a red background, and the purple glow of fires was spreading over Liptovsky Mikulas. The road was empty. I had no idea what was going on ahead, but I had a feeling that something was wrong. There was a roar and a noise in the distance. A moment later we found ourselves in the midst of an avalanche of soldiers, which was rolling in total darkness from Mikulas towards Okolichny, right across the snow-covered fields. Soon the mass of soldiers clogged the streets of the village and headed onwards. The thing was trashy. It never leads to good. To quell it is like stopping a flood in a broken dam. I rushed towards the fleeing soldiers, waving my pistol helplessly and shouting with all my might. In vain, no one paid any attention to me. There was horror in the eyes of the fleeing men. A little more, and they would have taken me with them. The soldiers ran without hearing or thinking. Should I shoot them? I wasn't capable of that. And again the calculations of our anti-tank 76M guns were at their best. Having taken positions in the breaches of houses and on the barns, they opened fire at the approaching Hitlerites. Houses in Okolichny caught fire, and the village square became as bright as day. The first brave men were joined by others. They became more and more. Panic was eliminated. By right of an officer of the highest rank, I took temporary charge of the defense organization. In the maelstrom of events, I completely forgot about my driver. In the midst of the general confusion, illuminated by the glow of the fires, despite the bursting of mines and shells, Space sat motionless at the wheel in the square. The engine was running quietly. The car was turned round in case of a possible departure, as I had ordered. The driver carried out the order with punctilious precision, as if all this commotion did not concern him. My conscience gnawed at me that I had left the car in the busiest place, as they say, in the tiger's mouth. It seemed incomprehensible to see Space sitting like a monument, without fear, calmly, resolutely. I mentally called him a knight. A few days later I put the medal for bravery on his chest, for his behaviour at Konska and in Okolichny. He was, of course, at the height of happiness. This medal Spacek did not take it off his chest until he was demobilized. He turned out to be an excellent driver. Sometimes we even had to moderate his courage. On March 3rd, after replacement of the Soviet division, the defence of the city was entrusted to the 1st Czechoslovak Brigade, and on the 8th day, despite all efforts, we left the city. It was a terrible blow. The Soviet units paid dearly for the capture of Liptovsky Mikulas. Their losses were all the more offensive because the success they had achieved could not be consolidated and developed. The last battles and defeat, after a thorough preparation, which had never been done before any previous offensive battle, the troops of the 1st Czechoslovak Corps were determined to deliver the final blow. During the preparatory period, the reasons for the failure of the 9-day fighting and the shortcomings in the combat training and morale of the personnel were revealed. The maximum possible measures were taken to eliminate these shortcomings. The Corps headquarters developed a new offensive plan, which provided for the main strike with the majority of forces on the northern flank of the front in the direction of Jar-Jalowiec. Contrary to the old tactics, it was decided to abandon artillery preparation and attack the infantry to take a sudden attack for the enemy at night. I had made a similar proposal before. Life has finally confirmed my rightness. In order to take the enemy by surprise in the usual scheme of artillery offensive were made significant adjustments. Thus, the infantry attacked the first line of trenches without artillery support. The infantrymen had to advance to the attack line at nightfall, overcoming the passages in minefields and wire fences before dawn. After the infantry would break into the first line of trenches, the artillery would, at a set signal, begin to make powerful fire strikes on the settlements located behind the enemy's forward defence line, and open barrage fire on the routes to the front line from the places where his troops were stationed at night. We were confident that this time we would break through. The only thing that worried us was the weather, because starting from 20 March the thaw came unexpectedly. The rapid melting of snow led to the fact that all the land overflowed with moisture, and country roads turned into solid puddles, in which cars were drowned up to their bodies. All this posed the danger of severely limiting the tactical manoeuvre of the artillery. The hour of reckoning was approaching. On 30 March at 4 a.m. a surprise attack began. Stunned in the first trenches of the enemy could not offer resistance. Strike groups of the 1st and 3rd Brigades, operating in the main direction, rapid onslaught suppressed enemy resistance at the front line of defence and began an unstoppable advance. Already in an hour and a half after the beginning of the offensive, battalions of the 1st Brigade reached the settlements of Trastein and Bobrovets, located 3 kilometres behind the German defence line. Even more significant successes were achieved by the units of the 3rd Brigade. With a quick, unexpected blow, they seized the first trenches of the enemy and began to pursue him on his heels in the direction of the stronghold in the area of Gage. On this section of the front, the brigade's vanguard advanced 7 kilometres in 2 hours of intense fighting. The brigade's units seized the 3rd line of defence here and entered the operational space. To complete the breakthrough of the 3rd Brigade, it remained to eliminate some pockets of resistance on the 3rd line of defence, located in the southern part of the offensive. The corps was marching towards final victory, and the enemy was on the verge of total defeat. The commander of the 18th Army, delighted with this success, hastened to arrive at the NP of the corps commander. General Bokek Pierre-Gerald Svoboda was already working in Kossis, and congratulated him and me. The matter was coming to an end. There was no longer any doubt about the complete collapse of the German defence. It was only a matter of time. But it wasn't. The last battle for Liptovsky Mikulas suddenly took a different course. Here's what happened. At the moment when Lieutenant General Gastilovich was shaking my hand, a catastrophe occurred which deprived us of any hope of final success. Through the powerful eyepieces of my binoculars, I saw something that both generals had not yet noticed. The 76M anti-tank guns, towed by Dodge vehicles, were stuck in a swamp on the slopes of a mountain near Bobrovets, and no force could pull them out. A blue cloud of smoke near the guns testified to the desperate efforts of the drivers of the vehicles to get out of the mire. The guns stood motionless on the horizon, the target of enemy artillery fire. Some guns slid down and tried in vain to climb the mountain again, though they remained intact for future fighting. The infantrymen of the 1st Brigade during the offensive disappeared behind the slope near Bobrovets, and the anti-tank guns were supposed to follow them in battle order. I was in despair. Not a single anti-tank gun had made it over the ridge that separated the advancing infantry from the artillery. At this point, my greatest fear was that the enemy would counterattack. But that is exactly what happened. Having come to his senses, the enemy launched a counterattack with the help of tanks and self-propelled guns, seeking to regain the lost settlements. At this time, there was nothing to fight effectively against the tanks. The Pasha infantry, after 3 hours of fierce fighting, was forced to retreat from Bobrovik, Trastein, and the surrounding heights. It found itself defenceless in the open snow-covered fields and began a hasty retreat to the starting line. The retreat did not end in panic, only because of the good training and morale of the soldiers. There was no great success. But this was not the worst. Due to the withdrawal of the 1st Brigade units from Bobrovets and Trastein, the left flank of the 3rd Brigade was exposed, which drove a wedge into the German defence in the northern section up to 7 kilometres deep. The front of the corps offensive near Jelovec turned steeply to the west. There was a danger that the units of the 3rd Brigade, which had moved far forward, would become the object of concentrated enemy attacks at the base of the wedge near Jelovec. And so it happened. A dangerous situation arose. The corps was in its most serious crisis since the sad days at Machnoka. The possible loss of Jelovec would have meant a break in the solid front just at its weakest point, and then the 3rd Brigade would have been surrounded. Instead of developing success in depth and along the front and turning combat success into growing tactical superiority, the corps had to defend itself and concentrate its forces in the opposite direction in order to hold the critical point, Jelovec. All this seriously undermined the success achieved on the northern flank of the front, which could have been of great importance for the subsequent fighting. The enemy, having occupied heights 828 and 915, had obtained a favourable bridgehead for encircling the Czechoslovak units and their subsequent destruction. In this extremely serious situation, I telephoned the Chief of Artillery of the 3rd Brigade to set a very important task: to immediately establish a strong anti-tank stronghold in the area of Jelovec and to hold it. However, the wire communication was interrupted. The radio was silent. The liaison sent out did not return. In the meantime, the enemy was preparing to take the chance. I could not do anything to counteract it. I was choked with anger. At this critical moment, I received a saving message from the chief of the Corps Engineering Service that the planking from Konskaya to Jar along the valley towards Bobrovitz had been completed. This meant that if the anti-tank guns could be transported along this road to the infantry, it would still be possible to avoid defeat. But it was already too late. The chief of artillery, who had called me, finally called out, I place all responsibility on you. Hold Jarowik at all costs. I shouted at the conclusion of our telephone conversation. Now both generals realized what had happened. The commander of the 18th Army said a couple of unflattering phrases about us and quickly left. A few minutes passed before the pallor of General Bocek's face disappeared. He spoke to me sternly and coldly, and there was bitterness in his voice. How did it happen? He asked with irritation. I could see that he was trying to be calm. With irony in his voice, the general continued, I shall probably reproach myself till the day I die for such a missed opportunity. I didn't think you'd let me down. He sighed. Those were the last words I heard from him. Thereafter he communicated with me only in writing. He helmed his disappointment. His hopes for a major success had vanished just at the moment when victory seemed assured. The Liptov Mountains were shrouded in a gloomy, bluish haze, and covered with barely visible whitish oblong clouds. They seemed fantastic against the pale blue sky. Mountains have always inspired me with a sense of peace. But this time, at the sight of the grief-stricken general, who looked as if he were trying to wake up from a terrible nightmare, I was not interested in mountains. What, in fact, happened? During the previous battles we had time to make sure that, contrary to all military rules, at the front of the excellent show themselves as oxen. These good-natured, extremely slow animals could confidently drag the guns through heavy, marshy terrain, step by step climb up steep slopes to the firing positions of artillery and mortars. Usually 6 or more pairs of oxen would pull a single gun, and pull without a sign of fear or fatigue to the tops of the mountains as if it were their eternal destination. Neither the close bursts of shells, nor the beatings or cursing, disturbed their unperturbed tranquility. The oxen continued their usual routine. The one thing that could not be obtained from them was that they should quicken their pace. No whip helped. Their wide, flat hooves were best suited for carrying heavy loads through the boggy, viscous terrain during the spring battles at Liptovsky, Mikulas. From 20 to 27 March, a command and staff exercise was held in the area of Witerna, Peruba, under the direction of the Corps headquarters, during which the staffs and commanders of the subordinate units were thoroughly acquainted with the offensive plan. Incidentally, there was also discussed the question of replacing the machine traction of 76M anti-tank guns with oxen sleds. The Chief of Artillery of the 1st Brigade, Major Veith, was also present at the exercise. I myself personally, even earlier, in connection with the upcoming offensive operation, issued an operational order where I obliged my subordinate officers to provide a sufficient number of oxen sledges for the transport of anti-tank guns. Realizing the exceptional importance of perfect tactical mobility of artillery, especially anti-tank artillery, in the conditions of spring thaw, I instructed my staff officers to check the progress of preparations for the offensive. In doing so, it was found that the Chief of Artillery of the 3rd Brigade had correctly assessed the value of ox-drawn harnesses and had secured 4-legged helpers. On the contrary, Major Veith had not done so and, by all accounts, had no intention of doing so. On my visit to the brigade, he confessed that he had no such harness. Where is it seen that oxen carry guns? Declared Veith. The time for the offensive was drawing near. What was to be done? As they say, you don't harness a horse in the middle of a ford. Unfortunately, I did not raise the question with the corps commander about the removal of this undisciplined officer. Instead, I asked the rear authorities to requisition all available oxen in the nearest district and bring them to the front. The pursuers were to wait for non-commissioned officers from the batteries at a predetermined place and drive the oxen to the firing positions. But that night, they had no luck. The non-commissioned officers waited in vain for the arrival of the draft force. The pursuers got lost while moving the herd, and when they finally got the oxen to their destination, it was too late. The infantry had already moved forward, and the anti-tank guns in tow of the Dodges followed the infantrymen. The tragedy had begun. The moment the terrible failure of the offensive was signalled, I was prepared for anything and yet was stunned when it actually happened. I was literally petrified of the terrible consequences, although somewhere in the depths of my soul did not disappear a spark of hope for a favourable outcome for us. Why then had no chance come to our rescue. The corps commander was out of his mind. On the same day, the general stated in writing that I was responsible for the catastrophe and I was responsible for it. I answered him also in writing. I hold the Chief of Artillery of the 1st Brigade, Major V8 and his Chief of Staff responsible for the failure of the 2nd Artillery Regiment to fulfill its combat mission during the attack of the infantry battalions of the 1st Brigade on Bravery and the surrounding heights on 30.3/1945. The mentioned officers, in spite of the instructions of the Corps Chief of Staff about the necessity to use oxen to transport anti-tank guns on the difficult terrain of the proposed offensive line, and in spite of the direct order in the order of the Corps Chief of Artillery to provide such harnesses, nothing to increase the mobility of the guns on the swampy terrain. Thus, they became guilty of disrupting a promising offensives. The enemy threw tanks and self-propelled guns against our infantry without hindrance, and, causing it losses in manpower, forced it to hastily retreat. As a result, tactically important positions were lost. Even without a reminder from higher headquarters, the artillery chief of the 1st Brigade was obliged to take all measures to ensure that the batteries of 76mm anti-tank guns overcame the difficult terrain and were able to follow the infantry. The fault of the Chief of Artillery of the 1st Brigade is aggravated by the fact, I wrote further, that before his appointment here, Major Veit is commander of an anti-tank regiment and participated in battles under similar conditions at Lower Kilmarnock and on Ondava. There he had the opportunity to see for himself how hard and slow it is to move 76mm anti-tank guns on a wet clay road if they are pulled by motor vehicles. Aggravating his guilt is the fact that he did not check the communications leading to the area of the supposed anti-tank defence. Had he done so, he would have established that the log road from Zaya to Jelovic was already passable, while the road from Smrksati to Bobrike was not yet suitable for motor vehicles. Major Veit, Chief of Artillery, 1st Brigade, watched idly as the commander of the anti-tank regiment desperately tried to overcome the ridge separating his batteries from the Czechoslovak infantry, and did not even help them get onto the carriageway. In view of the losses in men and moral damage suffered, I wrote in conclusion, and on the basis of principled and educational considerations, I request that Major V8 and his Chief of Staff be removed from their posts immediately, as soon as the situation permits, and that they be held criminally liable before a court-martial. All this can be read on a yellowed sheet of paper on which there is a date. 2 April 1945. It is true that the case never reached the court-martial, but at my urgent request Major Veit was soon removed from his post. Major Veit had arrived in the Czechoslovak Corps from England. He was undoubtedly a capable and brave officer, and had proved this at Jaslo and during the subsequent fighting in Slovakia. The disobedience of the order which resulted in such losses was not, in my opinion, a willful act. It came from an uncritical, arrogant attitude to professional skill, from a disregard for the Eastern experience of warfare on the Soviet front. Incidentally, this was also characteristic of some of the other officers who came from England. Another negative trait of Veit was excessive ambition, and this was obviously the root cause of the breakdown. Immediately after February 1948, he fled abroad with his family. Major Veit's indiscipline led on the afternoon of 30 March to a very critical situation. Everything then depended on the persistence of the weakened units of the 3rd Brigade, on whether they could hold the dominant heights of 828 and 915. To lose these heights would mean to lose the conditions for expanding the breakthrough of the Nazi defence in the Liptovsky Mikulas area. The enemy launched 5 persistent attacks against the left flank of the 3rd Brigade. Supported by tanks, self-propelled guns and the fire of all its artillery, it was unable to capture the heights. Our wounded soldiers refused to be evacuated to the rear and continued to fight. In this brightly manifested high political and moral qualities of the young replenishment, just past the course of combat training. The merit in holding the occupied positions belongs to the artillerymen of the 3rd Brigade. Here, on the marshy ground, ox-drawn carts, obtained from the local inhabitants, proved to be an invaluable means of pulling artillery and ammunition. In the vicinity of the village of Jalovets, where the enemy intended to strike, thanks to our 4-legged labourers, we managed to concentrate 2 batteries of 76mm anti-tank guns and 3 batteries of 120mm mortars. In addition, a platoon of 122mm howitzers took up firing positions to the east of the village for direct fire. However, the decisive battles for Jalois, which determined the fate of the 3rd Brigade, did not take place until the next day. The night of 31 March was spent in tense anticipation. In the morning, the enemy launched counterattacks on heights 823 and 915, but I had the impression that this was only a deceptive maneuver to divert our reserves from Jalalowiec to the very edge of the western flank of the brigade. Indeed, after 17 hours, a heavy battle broke out for Jalalowiec. First, the village was hit by a heavy artillery raid. Then infantry and self-propelled guns supported by anti-tank and anti-aircraft artillery fire went into the attack. Some of our soldiers panicked and fled. In this extremely critical situation, the calculations of anti-tank guns of the 4th Artillery Regiment, under the command of Staff Captain Havatoy, kept their composure and destroyed the attackers' vehicles with accurate fire from well-camouflaged positions at a distance of 700 meters. The remaining 2 self-propelled vehicles with infantry, which suffered heavy losses as a result of our mortar fire, hastily retreated. It was a great success. It heralded the end of the misfortunes of the 1st Czechoslovak Corps. On the night of 1 April, we regrouped our forces, but during the day, except 2 fierce night attacks, there was no more fighting. A counterattack against the northern bulge of the 3rd Brigade, undertaken after midnight on 2 April, was easily repulsed, and 3 April our units were in constant readiness for a decisive blow to the enemy defences. The following night, the enemy withdrew the main force along the valley through Ruzomberok to Big Fatra. Some of the Corps headquarters staff turned against me. I did not know what to do. I had not experienced this before. There was talk, poisoned arrows were hurled in my direction. It was all incomprehensible. Suddenly I was doing everything wrong. There was a case when I, in order to pursue the enemy with long-range fire, pulled a heavy course artillery regiment close to the infantry fighting order. They said that it was bad, risky, ill-conceived, that it was a mistake worthy of condemnation. My authority immediately fell. I felt that the solution of these questions belongs to others. All my attempts to maintain correct relations were in vain. The situation was drawn to the attention of the Corps liaison officer, Colonel Roganov of the Soviet Army. "Leave him alone," he said. "He is doing the right thing." I felt better at heart, but not for long. Then I remembered that there was only one person who could understand me, and I began to look for a meeting with him. On April 5, General Svoboda, who had been appointed Minister of National Defense, arrived at the front from Kosice. He greeted me with a gesture characteristic only of him. When I decided to explain everything, Svoboda patted me lightly on the shoulder, and I realized that he was already familiar with the whole bad story. "I know you," Svoboda said as he listened patiently, and smiled and shook my hand. I felt light at heart. Why were the battles at Liptovsky Mikulas so hard? The Czechoslovak Army Corps was formed in the USSR from the very beginning as a volunteer unit with a high level of discipline and morale, and passed through all the trials with honor. After the battles on Dukla, the corps was replenished right on the spot, without the necessary formation, by old reservists and young fighters who had been called up again. The Czechoslovak command faced a serious task, because already the first attacks in February, undertaken from the march, showed that the soldiers of the new replenishment had not yet merged with the main corps. The heroism of the soldiers who had been shot in the battles did not find support among the new recruits, in whose souls the fire of hatred for the enemy and fascist atrocities had not yet flared up. In early March, our unsuccessful attacks created new problems. If in January the young soldiers were drawn into the hardships of front life during the pursuit of the enemy from Ondava to Liptovsky and Mikulas, and the defects in their training and education could be gradually eliminated during the February defensive battles, the March replenishment had no such advantage. Experienced soldiers and officers killed in the first days of heavy fighting were immediately replaced by young ones. It was even more difficult to work with the replenishment that was continuously coming to the training units. Some of the mobilized were politically backward. This should not be surprising, since it was not only anti-fascists who joined the army. Some of the recruits found it hard to get used to the idea that they had been drafted into the army and were now parting with a safe life when they could hope to survive the war unharmed. Among them were some who had taken up arms for the first time and did not know how to handle them. All this, of course, adversely affected the combat effectiveness of infantry battalions. Faced with an experienced and stubborn enemy, such soldiers were not always at their best. If the March offensive battles were characterized by unprecedented ferocity, the February defensive battles that preceded them were characterized by unusual calm, on both sides of the front line. At that time, the Corps was intensively preparing for the breakthrough of the German defence. The focus of attention of the units was the forced training of the new arrivals. The duration of the training depended on the needs of the Corps. On the days of the heaviest fighting, the poorly trained soldiers were quickly sent to the front. The period of their training was reduced to the most extreme limit. Such a period was certainly not enough to prepare soldiers well for battle. In order to increase the level of combat training of the troops, the Corps commander ordered to organize in all units 44-hour additional training sessions, at the end of which to conduct at the Corps-level command and staff exercise breakthrough of the front edge of the enemy defense with subsequent combat in depth. All parts of the Corps were persistently preparing for a fight with the enemy, but he was not slumbering either and was improving his defense. Unsuccessful combat operations were in no small measure explained by poor reconnaissance. There was no way the Corps could take a prisoner, even if it was of little value, only to have him do some good. Every night on different parts of the front sent out patrols, ambushes and raids, but all was to no avail. The Nazis were not captured. Brave Liptovsky and other scouts died in vain under enemy fire when they went night after night to the trenches of the enemy. They could not take the tongue. In total, from 19 to 28 February, 37 sorties of scouts were carried out from this whole area, and only one was successful. Almost 100 attempts to take a prisoner were made in February. We lost our men, but no results. The Corps Chief of Staff, driven out of his mind by these failures, himself travelled at night to the battalions to check on the spot how the orders of the army commander and the Corps commander to capture a prisoner were being carried out. Finally, on one of the February nights, he was almost lucky enough to catch a goldfish. Having unexpectedly burst into Bravery's mill, our scouts caught there some Hitlerites who had wandered there in need. Hitlerites managed to escape, but the Krauts left a cap with a sign of Edelweiss. Thus, we got the proof that on the front near Liptovsky Mikulas there is a selected 3rd Mountain Division Edelweiss. This was a significant success of our intelligence. The scouts' report excited the headquarters of the 38th Army. Unfortunately, we did not long revel in the glory. On the 17th of February, the Army reported that parts of the mentioned division were hanging around in the area of Bilsk, north of the Beskid Mountains. Thus it became clear that the enemy had again changed his units in the strip of our corps, and this we were obliged to notice. Our static reconnaissance organs were more successful in detecting enemy firepower and minefields by observing and checking the front line. Of course, their data on the fighting order, strengths and organization of enemy units and their tasks were inaccurate and therefore unreliable, since they could not be compared with the testimony of prisoners. On the other hand, the in-depth reconnaissance patrols sent to the rear of the Nazi troops were excellent, so that the Corps usually had the best information in the whole army. However, the prisoners remained the main source of data on the organization and intentions of the enemy. We had no operational information about the enemy because of improper intelligence tactics. Instead of letting the enemy patrol into the depths of our defences and, having lured them into a trap, capture prisoners, the scouts were destroyed before they crossed the front line. That is, they deprived themselves of the opportunity to obtain valuable information in advance. Despite the dedicated efforts of the scouts, the results of combat reconnaissance remained unsatisfactory. Poor knowledge of the enemy's defensive system and its combat order proved to be a weak point of the Corps, especially when choosing targets to suppress the Nazi defense. Reconnaissance was the cornerstone on which all successful offensive operations of the Corps were based. The fighting of the 1st Czechoslovak Corps in the Liptovsky Mikulas area lasted just over 2 months, despite the fact that defensive fighting accounted for almost 3/4 of this time, and offensive fighting for only 1/3. These battles were the bloodiest in the history of the Czechoslovak forces, except for the Battle of Duklin. Fighting alongside the Soviets, the Corps was operating in a secondary operational direction, so it was not sufficiently provided with the necessary means, as the question of victory over Hitler was being decided in the main directions, primarily in the direction of Warsaw and Berlin. Even the enormous resources of the Soviet army were not inexhaustible. The entire burden of fighting in this, predominantly mountainous, area against strong, well-chosen and equipped enemy defences fell on the shoulders of infantry and purely artillery units of the Corps, and until the moment of redeployment to the Soviet 24th Division. Soviet military science and Soviet military art were steadfastly guided by the position of maximum concentration of combat, means in decisive strategic directions and their effective use by successive escalating strikes against the enemy. This provision did not allow the fragmentation and weakening of strikes, as a result of which there were fewer means in secondary directions. Full advantage was given to those directions in which the question of a quick end to the war was solved. Thus, the offensive had to be carried out only with the forces available to the corps. This is the answer to the often raised question about the reasons for the heavy fighting at Liptovsky Mikulas. The Czechoslovak units in the area of Bolshaya and Malafatra would find themselves in a similar situation a little later. The battles at Liptovsky Mikulas took their rightful place in the history of the liberation of the Czechoslovak Republic from Nazi enslavement. It should not be forgotten that it was in the major battles on the territory of the Republic. On Dukla, at Liptovsky Mikulas, in the mountains of Big and Little Fatra, that the 1st Czechoslovak Army Corps actually proved itself as a new type of military unit, which served as the basis for the creation of the new Czechoslovak Army. With its active combat and political activity, the 1st Czechoslovak Army Corps made a significant contribution to the complete victory of the People's Democratic Revolution. We must not forget the fierce nature of these battles and the dear price we paid for the freedom of our homeland. An eloquent testimony to this is the memorial and mass graves erected near Mikulas on Mt. Gay. Many veterans and newly conscripted fighters fought selflessly in the harsh battle, which did not bring success for a long time, but the main burden of the struggle was borne by the thinning ranks of the veterans of Dukly. They formed the nucleus of both the defence and the brave attack. Much credit for our victory belongs to the party and political workers, all honoured veterans of the Corps, who purposefully for 2 months every day carried out concrete painstaking work in the troops to combat harmful attitudes, persistently exposing hostile views. As a result, young soldiers in a short period of time became worthy successors to the fighting traditions of the Corps, learnt to hate the fascist invaders. Shy in the past recruits learnt to bravely and persistently fight hard. Thanks to all educational measures day by day developed combat and moral qualities of soldiers, growing political consciousness of the troops, and thus strengthened the Corps itself. And so until the final victory over the fiercely resisting enemy. In the battles on Big Fatra, and especially on Little Fatra, our soldiers proved to be hardened fighters. Big Fatra threatens. On 5 April, after the liberation of Liptovsky Mikulas, units of the 3rd Brigade advanced westwards, and were the first to penetrate into Ružomberok. They were followed by units of the 4th Brigade. After a short street battle, the town was liberated and the enemy was forced to retreat further. We entered a dead town, a town without flags. No one greeted us. It felt as if we were in an occupied city. The church in Cerno near Ružomberok, Glinka's former home, seemed to be threatening. Fortunately, we did not stay in this town for long. We were drawn to the mountains, to the villages. For the liberation of Ružomberok, which was considered the core of the German defence on the Vega, the 1st Czechoslovak Corps was awarded the Order of the Red Star in Stalin's order. During the period of pursuit of the enemy, there were changes in the leadership of the Corps. At the suggestion of the Minister of National Defence, General Ludvík Svoboda, on April 5, General Karel Klapalek, formerly the commander of the 3rd Brigade, took command of the wounded at the beginning of the battle for Liptovsky Mikulas and barely recovered. He returned to the Corps in early April, catching up with it at Ružomberok. Klapalek, with his ascetic pale face, on which shone lively calm eyes, was a man of cold will. Characterized by a cautious nature, as a commander Klapalek knew his business well, quickly assessed the situation and prospects. He was a commander of calculated courage. Exceptional, hardened in the trials of calmness, contrived coldness, under the shell of which hid a delicate nature, a direct, slightly ironic look. These qualities are particularly liked in him soldiers. Retreating, the enemy destroyed railways and highways and the objects located on them, created obstacles, arranged obstacles and rubble, which slowed down the advance of the Corps units. On the evening of 5 April, after a short battle, units of the 3rd Brigade captured the village of Gombash, and the next morning all brigades began to advance on Luboknia. The battles for Bolshaya Fatra clearly confirmed the correctness of the tactics of fighting in mountainous and wooded terrain. At first glance, they synthesized the experience of the battles at Dukla. The Corps commander supplemented it with tactical skill and intuition in assessing the difficulties of fighting in the mountains. At that time, much depended on his decision, on what path to take to overcome the Great Fatra, whose peaks rise above the Wag Valley from 700 to 1,000 meters and firmly block the way to the west. If the corps had gone along the Vega Valley, it would have paid many lives for overcoming the Kraljevan Gorge. Therefore, the Corps Command decided to bypass the gorge from the south and provide a direct crossing of the main forces through the Bolshaya Fatra on a wide front. The 1st Brigade advanced through the Luboknyansko saddle to Krapilayny. The 4th Brigade was struggling through heavy snow-covered terrain, past the Magura and Klak Mountains towards Turksansky Martin. The 3rd Brigade marched along the Vega Valley towards Kraljevani and Turani, having its main forces on the right side of the river. The decision of the Corps Command to send the 4th Brigade to the remote left flank of the advancing unit's combat order was of crucial importance for the outcome of the operation. The decisive moment in the first phase of the Fatra campaign came when this brigade, having reached the Magura and Clark mountain ranges, was given operational space both for action against the enemy troops in front of the 1st Brigade's front and for manoeuvring towards Martin. The allocation for this purpose of the 4th Brigade, which consisted of 90% Slovaks, testified to the foresight of the command, which understood the political significance of the liberation of the main town of Turek. Thus, on 7 April, all brigades of the Corps operated in the 1st Echelon, fighting in the Fatra Mountains in harsh winter conditions against an experienced and stubborn enemy. All the forces of the Corps were deployed on a broad mounting front. This, of course, dispersed them into separate battalions and small strike groups, acting in most cases isolated, but was caused by the peculiarities of the offensive in the mountainous conditions of Fatra. Heavy fighting required from our infantrymen to strain all physical and spiritual forces. But in just 3 days we managed to break the resistance of the enemy's strongholds, overcome the difficult mountains of Bolshaya Fatra, and liberate Martin. However, Bolshaya Fatra was a prelude to even heavier battles that awaited us on Malaya Fatra. On 7 April, the 3rd Brigade was given the most difficult task of forcing the flooded Orava River. Part of the force was positioned on the heights on the eastern left bank. Units of the Czechoslovak battalion took up defence in front of the broken railway bridge across the river. Immediately in the afternoon, after a short preparation, our machine gunners decisively attacked the Hitlerites. Near the ruins of the bridge, a battle broke out. The attack of our assault group could be smothered in machine gun fire of the enemy, but artillerymen of the 3rd Battery dashingly pulled out on a steep, bare mountain several anti-tank guns and shot enemy machine gun nests. The attack continued to be successful. Under enemy fire, the fighters bravely crossed the remains of the bridge to the right bank of the Orava and seized a bridgehead there. A Czechoslovak warrior remained among the iron structures of the bridge on the wire fence. After the battle, he was found dead. How long had he been hanging upside down before he died? You can't erase such a picture from your memory. On my way back to Luboknya, I thought about this unknown soldier. The next day in the morning, I visited the cemetery near the hospital in Lubokna. It was set up by the Nazis in August 1944, when the Slovak national uprising broke out. In Lubokna, lieutenants of Göring's Luftwaffe were treated for wounds received in air battles with enemies of the Reich. On the night of 30 August, their treatment ended. And then I remembered Hitler's speech of September 1939. There will be no grief and tears of German mothers. The Führer was singing then, having unleashed a blitzkrieg against Poland and expecting a quick victory there. A small cemetery with birch crosses made a dreary impression. It was a stranger among the buildings of the hospital. I have other memories from that day. 2 of us with General Klepelik followed the troops along the noisy river Luboknyanka. There were long shadows across the road. The lay stood in a wall all around. Dark spruces crowded near each other. Among them there were amazing specimens several girths thick. As we walked up the narrow valley from Luboknya to the Magura Fork, we were surrounded by silence. The forest was silent. After the noise of the shots, it seemed to have closed in on itself, absorbing the shouts and drowning out the movement. The forest surrounded us from all sides, and we wanted to see the distance. At the fork of the main ridge we saw an outwardly unremarkable short man. He was hunched over, sitting on the road. When we approached him, we glanced at each other, as strangers usually do when they meet on a blind road. The man smiled uncertainly and asked timidly if he could not come with us, for it was averse to walk alone among these woods in time of war. We replied that it would be more fun with the 3 of us. "Where the hell are you going?" I asked him. "To Podradye, if you'll excuse me." It's a 4-hour walk from here. Why so late? I'm looking for my nephew, Jura. He was with the rebels during the uprising. I waited all day, but I never saw Uri. Ooh, who's Jura? Mela. Bela from Podradi. Uri Bela. I stopped for a rest. What a hill. And what a surprise, my faithful Bela from Podradia was wanted by my uncle as a missing person. He'll come. He'll be here soon. And where is this shooting? May I ask you? You'll find out soon enough. We were climbing with the corps commander up the steep slopes of Magura. Shells were whistling above our heads. The rumble of bursts came from afar. The general slowly climbed up the slope, stopping and listening at times. Evening stars appeared in the darkening sky. At the top of the ridge we stopped. Klapalik looked to the west, and the warm light of the passing day was reflected in his eyes. Then he spoke, about life, about hopes. It was the 8th of April 1945. On that day the main forces of the Corps had